It is my birthday, a day that should feel warm. But instead the room feels heavy, like smoke clinging to the walls. My daughter insisted on hosting a small gathering at her house, and I arrived carrying only a bottle of cheap whiskey wrapped in the newspaper I read every morning. The paper crinkles in my hand like an admission of weakness. As I place it on the table, she bursts into laughter. "Dad, is that all you could bring? Your pockets must be emptier than ever." The words cut through me sharper than the cake knife resting untouched beside the candles. I glance at the knife, its polished blade reflecting a distorted version of my tired face, and I feel the old gap between us widen. We have not been close for nearly 3 years. Once I raised her alone after her mother passed, stitching her dresses by hand and warming soup on cold nights. But now she looks at me as though I am a stranger, one who overstayed his welcome. Around us, the relatives shift uneasily, pretending to adjust their glasses or sip their drinks. But silence speaks louder than their murmurs. On the table sits a small brass object that almost no one notices, a safe key dangling from my worn keychain. Its teeth are slightly bent, its head scratched from years of being pressed into locks. To them, it is meaningless, just another piece of metal. To me, it is the last trace of my hidden strength, the keeper of what she never cared to ask about. My late wife once tied a red ribbon to this key, marking it with her delicate handwriting for later. I still see the faded ink when I hold it close. That ribbon, though, now frayed, reminds me of her touch, her perfume, her unwavering belief that someday this key would matter. But tonight, in front of everyone, my daughter leans closer and sneers. "Dad, maybe you should stop pretending you have anything left. You've given us nothing. You are nothing." The laughter that follows is louder than the clinking glasses. My chest tightens, not from age alone, but from betrayal deeper than any illness. I think of my weak heart, the doctor's warnings, the way each humiliation could be the one that breaks me for good. And yet I do not answer. I only smile faintly, fingers brushing the brass key in my pocket. She doesn't know what I keep locked away, what truths wait in silence. And that was only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Before this rift grew between us, life seemed smaller but far kinder. I remember mornings in the old house where sunlight filtered through cracked wooden blinds, painting stripes across the kitchen floor. My daughter would sit on a stool, her legs swinging, as I fried eggs in the blackened pan that had belonged to her grandmother. She used to laugh at the way I whistled old folk songs about rivers and rice fields I learned as a boy in the countryside. Back then, my pockets were no less empty than today, but she never seemed to mind. She would chase after fireflies in the evening, and I would clap slowly, pretending each spark was magic. Ordinary days passed with rhythm, me repairing shoes for neighbors, or studying at the worn oak table. I taught her how to mend a torn sleeve, and she once told me, "Dad, you can fix anything." That sentence lingers now, like a cruel echo. Because somewhere along the way, the warmth of that voice hardened into ice. Perhaps it was when she first stepped into the city, dazzled by tall glass buildings and polished shoes. She returned from college visits speaking less, her words edged with impatience, her eyes darting away whenever I tried to ask about her studies. Money was always short, yet our dinners tasted rich to me, bowls of rice, pickled vegetables, and sometimes a small piece of salted fish. She used to nibble slowly, savoring every bite. But the last few years she would frown, poking at her food, asking why we never ate what her friends' families did: steak, foreign chocolates, wine. I reminded her that even emperors once valued simple dishes like millet porridge for strength and clarity. She rolled her eyes, calling it old people's wisdom. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment the contempt took root, but I recall the first time she refused to walk beside me on the street. She claimed I smelled of leather and glue from my shoe repairs, that my jacket was too old. That day, the distance between us stretched farther than any road. Silence has its own way of speaking, and it told me something was breaking. Still, I tried to hold on to the ordinary. I kept polishing the brass safe key, as if by caring for it I could preserve our bond. To me, it was more than a key, it was a memory of promises made with her mother before she passed. We had hidden away, not only savings, but a fragment of hope for our daughter's future. And yet, as I watched her drift away, I wondered if she would ever understand the value of things not seen. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. The safe key rests in my palm, heavier than it should be. Its brass surface is dulled with age, its grooves worn down like wrinkles on an old face. When I run my thumb across it, I can almost feel my wife's touch again. She tied a thin red ribbon to it the night before she passed, whispering, "This will protect her when I cannot." The ribbon has long since frayed, but a faint trace of her handwriting on a tiny note still clings to it for later. That word later has haunted me for years. When is later? Has the moment arrived, or have I been too cowardly to face it? I keep the key on my chain close enough to feel its weight against my leg, yet I never speak of it. My daughter sees only the empty wallet, the patched shoes, the worn jacket. She thinks that is all I am. She doesn't realize that sometimes silence guards the most important truths. The safe itself sits hidden behind an old cabinet in the storage room, the wood swollen from humidity. Few people know it exists. Fewer still know what's inside. Inside are papers, title deeds, certificates, a small ledger that records years of quiet saving, every coin I tucked away while she thought I wasted it on whiskey. The safe also contains something rarer than money. A photograph of her as a child holding her mother's hand, her smile brighter than any treasure. My wife insisted it be locked away as though the photograph itself could protect us. I recall a folk saying my grandfather often repeated, "A key does not shout, but it holds power greater than a sword." At the time, I laughed at the simplicity. Now I realize he was right. The safe key, silent and unnoticed, holds the power to shift the ground beneath my daughter's feet. Yet even as I trace its grooves, I hesitate. Why haven't I shown her yet? Perhaps because revealing it feels like surrendering my last secret, the final card I hold close. Once opened, there will be no going back. Her contempt will meet the truth, and one of us will be left broken. I slip the key back into my pocket, listening to the faint metallic clink. It feels like a heartbeat steady, reminding me of a promise I must one day keep. I thought I was safe, but I was wrong. 3 years. That is how long my daughter and I spent circling each other like strangers under the same roof. She lived her life sleek and modern. Her phone buzzing with friends I never met, her words clipped and hurried. I remained in the old house, its walls echoing with memories she had no patience for. 3 years is not just time, it is silence hardened into stone, a distance that no bridge seems able to cross. I remember the first time she refused to answer my call. It was during her second year at university. I had saved enough to buy her a warm coat for winter, one lined with soft fur secondhand but still fine. I dialed her number, excited, but the call rang and rang before cutting off. When she finally returned my message, it was curt: busy. Don't call me so much. That short reply felt like ice water poured over my chest. Since then, I learned to hold my words inside. Our conversations grew rarer, replaced with awkward silences. When she visited, her eyes wandered, always searching for something better than the worn furniture and the smell of old books. Once she caught me rereading a letter her mother had written years ago, the paper creased and fragile. She glanced at it and muttered, "You still keep that junk." I wanted to explain that it wasn't junk. It was the last trace of the woman who had bound us together. But the words stuck in my throat. Silence again filled the space. During those 3 years, I noticed her contempt sharpen whenever money was mentioned. She would compare me to her friends' fathers' men, with polished cars, pressed suits, and fat wallets. She didn't know that in my drawer lay deeds, bonds, and a ledger written in careful strokes. She only saw the surface-patched shoes, old phone, worn-out wallet, and in her eyes, I was less than the fathers she admired. I read once in a medical journal that loneliness in the elderly increases the risk of heart disease as much as smoking does. I believe it. Because each time she laughed at me, ignored me, or turned away, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't only age pressing on my heart, it was betrayal, slow and steady like drops of water carving a rock. Still, the folk wisdom of my youth whispered, "The silent tree grows the strongest roots." So I stayed silent, nurturing roots of patience, even as she drifted farther. I hoped naively that one day she might look back and see the trunk that had always stood firm for her. But silence has its own way of speaking, and its message was clear. Something darker was coming. It began quietly, like a crack forming in the wall that no one notices until the whole house groans. One evening, she invited me to dinner at her apartment. I brought along a jar of homemade pickled radish the way my wife used to make. When I placed it on the table, her lips curled in a half-smile that wasn't kind. "Dad, you really still eat this? People don't eat such old-fashioned food anymore." She pushed the jar aside as though it were a dirty rag. Her words stung, but I swallowed my pride. I reminded her that fermented foods have kept our people strong for centuries, how soldiers once carried jars of kimchi into battle, how farmers relied on radish and rice during the hardest winters. She rolled her eyes, muttering, "You sound like a history book." Nobody cares. That was the first time I sensed not just impatience, but contempt. Later that night, I overheard her speaking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was sharp, hurried, and it wasn't the playful tone I remembered from her childhood. He has nothing. Trust me, no savings, no assets. All he owns is the smell of leather and dust. When he's gone, there will be nothing to fight over. My chest tightened as if the words themselves pressed down on my ribs. She thought I was already finished, already written out of life's ledger. I sat in the dim light of her kitchen, staring at the wooden chopsticks resting on a porcelain plate. Ordinary objects, but they felt unusual in that moment, like witnesses to a crime of words. I wondered if the silence between us had turned her heart this cold, or if someone else had planted such cruel thoughts in her. I thought back to a proverb my father once told me: "The axe forgets, but the tree remembers." She had forgotten the years I stitched her clothes, the nights I walked miles to fetch medicine when she was ill, but I remembered. And I could not ignore the way her voice sliced me open. That night I left her apartment without saying much. She barely noticed, too busy scrolling through her phone. The street outside smelled faintly of chestnuts roasting, a smell that once made her eyes light up as a girl. Now the scent only made me ache. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. It happened during a family gathering, one of those rare nights when uncles, cousins, and neighbors filled the old dining room with chatter. I had dressed in my best, though my best was nothing more than a faded jacket with patched elbows and shoes whose soles had been replaced more times than I could count. Still, I wanted to look presentable, at least for the sake of dignity. My daughter stood near the head of the table, glowing in her silk blouse, her hair pulled into a sleek bun. She poured wine into glasses, her voice loud and confident, as if she wanted everyone to hear. At first she played the polite host, but when the conversation turned to finances, she struck like a snake. "Look at my father," she said, her laugh sharp as glass. "Always carrying that empty wallet around. He can't even buy himself a new phone. He's living proof that if you don't work smart, you end up with nothing." She turned to her husband's relatives, who smirked politely, trying to mask their discomfort. Sometimes I wonder how I survived growing up with so little. The words hit me harder than any physical blow. My hands trembled on the table, gripping my chopsticks so tightly they nearly snapped. Around me, silence spread like spilled ink. My younger cousin cleared his throat, muttered something about the food, but his eyes avoided mine. Everyone felt the shame, yet no one spoke up. On the table sat a porcelain teapot, its spout chipped, a relic from my wife's dowry. I had brought it from home because she once loved serving tea in it. Now, under the harsh light of my daughter's words, it seemed like another relic of failure, something to laugh at. But inside, I remembered a fact I once read: humiliation activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. I believe it. In that moment, my chest ached as though I had been struck. The humiliation seared deeper because it came not from strangers, but from the child I raised with my bare hands. I wanted to rise to speak, to remind her of the winters I walked barefoot to buy her medicine, of the nights I worked until dawn, stitching shoes by candlelight so she could go to school, but my throat locked. Silence again held me hostage. Across the room, the brass safe key in my pocket pressed against my thigh, a reminder, a weight. She thought I had nothing, but the truth remained locked away, patient as stone. Silence has its own way of speaking, and that night it told me the world had just shifted and there was no going back. After that night, humiliation burned in my chest long after the guests had left. I walked home under the cold streetlights, each step echoing against the pavement like an accusation. I told myself I wouldn't let her words break me, but they lingered, festering. The next morning, I began paying closer attention, watching, listening, searching for answers I had ignored for too long. I noticed things I hadn't before: letters arriving at the house in envelopes I didn't recognize, law offices, real estate firms. She snatched them quickly, sometimes tearing them open before even reaching her room. Once, I saw her slip a folded document into her handbag with a furtive glance, unaware that I was standing in the hallway. It reminded me of a folk saying my grandfather used to murmur: "The snake doesn't rattle until it's ready to strike." Her quiet movements, her lowered voice on late-night calls, all told me she was coiling, preparing. One afternoon, while she was out, I sat at the kitchen table and sifted through the pile of junk mail. Beneath the flyers and advertisements was an envelope bearing the faint scent of perfume, though not hers. Inside was a neatly typed letter addressed to her, congratulating her on preliminary approval for something I couldn't quite decipher. It mentioned property transfers, legal filings, and inheritance claims. My chest tightened. Was she trying to move things into her name already, as though I were already gone? I replaced the letter carefully, but the seed of doubt had already sprouted. To test her, I left an old drawer unlocked in my study. Inside, I placed only blank papers and one cracked fountain pen. Days later, I found the drawer slightly ajar. The pen moved. She had searched it. She was looking for something, proof documents, anything that tied me to ownership. That night, while she sat scrolling her phone, I pretended to doze in the armchair. Her voice carried softly as she whispered into the receiver. "He doesn't suspect a thing. Soon it'll all be in my name." My jaw clenched, but I kept my breathing steady, feigning sleep. It was then I realized this was no simple contempt or careless cruelty. She was making plans, quietly laying a trap, believing me too weak, too simple to notice. I thought I was safe, but I was wrong. The drawer had been in my study for decades, part of an old desk my wife and I bought secondhand when our daughter was still in grade school. Its oak frame was scarred with scratches from years of use, and one handle dangled loose as if always threatening to fall away. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than tired furniture. But to me, it was a quiet guardian. Behind its lock lay things I hoped would one day protect us: documents, receipts, even letters my wife had written in her delicate script. I kept the key separate from my other keys, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. For years, my daughter never touched the desk. She used to sit beside me as a girl, scribbling homework while I repaired shoes under the lamp's soft glow. But lately, I noticed faint scratches around the drawer's lock. New ones, as though someone had tried to pry it open. My stomach turned cold. One evening, when she was out late, I slid the key into the lock and opened the drawer. The familiar smell of paper and dust greeted me. The contents were still in place, though slightly shuffled, a deed folded differently than I remembered, a ledger pushed to the back. And tucked between the folders was something I hadn't noticed before, a small slip of paper torn from the corner of an envelope. On it, in hurried handwriting, were the words, "Find the safe." And my pulse quickened. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to suspect. I closed the drawer, slowly locking it again, my hand trembling. The safe had always been my final defense, my wife's last request. If she discovered it before I was ready, everything would unravel. Later that night, while making tea, I caught my daughter watching me from the doorway. Her eyes flicked to the pocket where the brass safe key hung on my chain. For just a moment, her smile faltered, replaced by something colder, sharper. She quickly turned away, humming as if nothing had happened. I poured the tea carefully, noticing how the steam curled upward, vanishing into silence. A folk belief came to mind: steam rising means spirits are listening. Perhaps my wife was listening, warning me not to underestimate what was unfolding. Silence has its own way of speaking, and in that silence, I understood my daughter was closer to the truth than I had feared. The half-confession came unexpectedly, slipping from her lips like a dagger wrapped in silk. We were sitting in the living room, the old clock ticking louder than our words. She had poured herself a glass of wine, swirling it lazily as though she were already celebrating something I could not see. "Dad," she began, her voice casual. "Too casual. You don't have to worry about, well, what happens later. I'll take care of everything. The house, the papers. You can just rest." She sipped, her wine eyes glittering, watching for my reaction. Her words landed heavy, though she tried to dress them as kindness. Later. That word again, the same one my wife had written on the note tied to the safe key. But from my daughter's mouth, it meant something else entirely. Later meant without me. Later meant she had already imagined a world where I was gone. I asked her lightly, "And how do you plan to take care of everything?" My tone was steady, but my chest thumped against my ribs. She smirked, lowering her voice. "I've spoken to someone. Just to understand things, lawyers handle these transitions better when they know ahead of time." There it was, the slip, the half-confession. She had revealed enough to confirm what I suspected, but cloaked in just enough vagueness to deny it if I pushed. I stared at her, searching for a trace of the girl who once clung to my hand at school gates, who once whispered she'd never leave me alone. All I found was calculation. On the table between us sat a bowl of roasted chestnuts. She cracked one open carelessly, letting the shell fall onto the carpet. The smell, sweet and nutty, reminded me of autumn fairs where she once begged me for chestnut cakes. Ordinary food made strange in this moment, a witness to betrayal. A thought crept into my mind, almost unbearable. Perhaps she didn't only want to secure her future. Perhaps she wanted me erased from the present too. I remembered reading once that in some cultures, whispering the word later at a family altar was considered dangerous, as if calling death nearer. My wife had written it with love. My daughter spoke it with greed. I said nothing more that evening. I let the silence spread thick and tense until she grew restless and excused herself. But inside me a storm raged. Her half-confession was more than words, it was a warning. She was ready to strike and she thought I was too weak to stop her. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. The argument erupted like a sudden storm, though the clouds had been gathering for years. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that once meant family walks and shared meals. Instead, we stood in the living room, the air heavy with dust and unspoken resentment. She had found me sitting at my old desk, the brass safe key glinting faintly on the chain at my side. "Why do you still keep that useless piece of junk?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You act like you're guarding treasures, but everyone knows you have nothing. Stop pretending." I tried to remain calm, to remind her that not all wealth can be measured in money. This house, these memories I began. But she cut me off with a bitter laugh. "Memories don't pay bills. Memories don't buy me the life I deserve. You wasted your years fixing other people's shoes, and now what? You can't even provide for yourself. You're nothing but a burden." Her words came fast, each one hotter than the last, as if she had rehearsed them in her mind. I clenched my hands together, knuckles white, my chest rising and falling in quick bursts. I thought of something I once read in a psychology article, that children who humiliate their parents often do so not from truth but from fear. Fear of becoming what they mock. I wondered if deep down she feared poverty as much as I had once feared losing her. But my silence only enraged her more. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "Say something, admit it. You have nothing, you'll leave nothing. I'll handle the inheritance when the time comes, because you failed." At that moment the key pressed against my thigh like a brand, reminding me of what she did not know. I wanted to pull it out, to show her, to shout that she was wrong. But something held me back. Perhaps the memory of my wife's whisper for later. The air between us was charged thick with anger. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to hesitate between ticks. Finally, I stood, my voice low but firm. "One day you will regret speaking to me like this." For a brief second her face faltered, then hardened again. She turned away, muttering, "We'll see." I thought I was safe. But I was wrong. It was late in the evening when I learned the truth. I had returned from the market carrying a small bag of rice and a bundle of herbs wrapped in paper. The apartment was quiet. Almost too quiet. Then I saw the envelope on the table, half tucked beneath a magazine. The bold letterhead made my stomach twist: Law Office of Kim and Park. Curiosity overcame caution. My hands trembled as I unfolded the papers inside. The words leapt at me like fire. Transfer of property rights. Preliminary claim of inheritance. Executor, my daughter's name. She had already signed her name, as if my life had been erased and the ink was final. The betrayal struck deeper than any insult. She hadn't waited, hadn't even spoken to me. In her mind, I was already gone. She had gone behind my back, telling strangers, the lawyer, the clerks, that she was the rightful heir, that I was a relic taking up space. When she returned home, I confronted her. The rice bag was still on the counter, its grains spilling across the floor like scattered teeth. I held the papers in my hand. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice shaking but louder than I had expected. She didn't flinch. Instead, she shrugged, pouring herself a glass of water. "It's just preparation, Dad. Someone has to take care of things when you're gone." She didn't even look at me when she said gone. "Gone." I repeated the word, sour in my mouth. "I'm standing right here. I'm not dead." Finally, her eyes met mine, cold and sharp. "Not yet. But let's be honest, you've got nothing left. I'm simply making sure what little there is doesn't slip away." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, even my own shallow breathing. It was then I realized the betrayal wasn't just in the papers, it was in her heart. She had written me off completely. A strange calm washed over me. I remembered a cultural detail from years ago. In some villages, families burned incense at night to ward off betrayal, believing smoke could keep false hearts away. I wished for incense now, but all I had was the brass safe key pressing against my thigh. I thought of my wife's note, the faded ink that read, "For later." Perhaps later had finally arrived. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. The night after discovering the legal papers, sleep would not come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling where faint cracks stretched like rivers on an old map. My chest felt heavy, as though betrayal itself had weight. Finally, I rose, lit a small lamp, and went to the study. Something inside me urged me to open the drawer again, to see with my own eyes what remained mine. The lock clicked open softly like a sigh. I shuffled through the deeds, the ledger, the documents, proofs of a life I had tried to build in silence. And then pressed between two stiff folders, I found an object I had almost forgotten, an old photograph. It was small edges curling, the black and white surface faded. In it, my wife stood beneath a blooming cherry tree, holding our daughter's hand. She must have been no older than 7, then her hair tied in 2 messy braids, her smile wide and unguarded. On the back, in my wife's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Promise her a future. For later." The ink had thinned over the years, but I traced each letter with my finger, as if touching her hand again. The photograph was more than memory. It was proof of love, of sacrifice, of a time when family meant everything. I realized then that the safe was not only a vault of money and deeds, it was also a shrine of trust built brick by my wife's faith. As I held the photo, I remembered something odd. My daughter, just weeks earlier, had asked casually if there were any old family photos she could use for a genealogy project. I brushed it off at the time, thinking it harmless. But now I understood. She wasn't seeking history. She was searching for leverage, proof of ownership evidence to twist whatever she could use to erase me from my own life. The photograph trembled in my hand as I placed it back into the drawer, locking it tight once more. My heart pounded with a mix of sorrow and anger. She thought she knew everything, but she hadn't seen this. She hadn't seen her mother's message, the trace of a promise that still bound me to her, despite her cruelty. The lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across the room. In the silence, I felt my wife's presence, as if she were whispering through the walls. "Hold on. Not yet." Silence has its own way of speaking. And that night it told me the photograph was not just memory. It was a weapon waiting for its moment. The photograph lingered in my mind long after I locked the drawer. My daughter's laughter, her cruel words, the legal documents, all of it swirled like a storm. Yet in the eye of that storm, I felt something unexpected, calm. A silence that was not weakness this time, but resolve. I realized I had been clinging to the hope that she would change, that she would remember the nights I held her fevered hand, or the mornings I walked miles to buy her textbooks. But each insult, each betrayal carved that hope thinner until only bone remained. I could no longer wait for her kindness. I would have to protect what was mine in silence until the time came to reveal the truth. That night I slipped the brass safe key from my chain and placed it under my pillow. I wanted to feel its weight close to me, like a soldier sleeping with his weapon. I thought of my wife's note again. For later. My resolve hardened. Later would come when she least expected it. In the days that followed, I practiced patience like a monk. When my daughter mocked my patched shoes, I said nothing. When she laughed at my old phone, I let her laugh. Outwardly, I appeared beaten small, a man defeated by time. Inwardly, I sharpened my silence into steel. I remembered a detail from an article I once read about Japanese kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks are not hidden, but illuminated, making the object more beautiful because it has been broken. Perhaps my life too was filled with cracks. But instead of crumbling, I would fill them with gold hidden in my safe until the right moment. One evening as we ate dinner, she snapped, "Why do you just sit there quiet? Don't you care?" I met her gaze, and for the first time in months allowed a small smile to curve my lips. "Silence has its own way of speaking," I said softly. She frowned, confused, perhaps even unsettled. She didn't know what I meant, but I did. The silence between us was no longer weakness. It was resolve, and it would save me when the time came. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. The night of the dinner was meant to be ordinary, but betrayal has a way of finding a stage. She had invited relatives, even a few neighbors, to celebrate her husband's promotion. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table, a guest in the house I once called my own. The aroma of roasted duck filled the room, mingling with laughter and clinking glasses. For a brief moment, I almost believed we were still family. Then she stood, glass in hand, smile polished. Her voice rang louder than the others. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," she began, and the room hushed. "We've worked hard to build this life, and we couldn't have done it without support. But let's be honest, some people here have given nothing." Her eyes slid toward me, sharp as a blade. "Some people live on memories and expect the rest of us to carry them." The words froze the air. Chopsticks hung suspended above bowls, glasses stopped mid-air. My cousin coughed nervously, but no one spoke. She laughed a cruel sound. "Look at my father. Still carrying that same empty wallet, wearing the same old jacket. He has nothing, and he'll leave nothing." The humiliation landed heavier because it was public, delivered with the precision of a knife to the gut. My hand drifted to my pocket where the brass safe key pressed against my thigh. For a moment I considered standing, slamming it onto the table, revealing everything, but I heard my wife's voice in memory. For later. Not yet. I stayed silent. I poured myself tea from the chipped porcelain pot my wife once loved. The steam curled upward, vanishing like smoke from incense. In some folktales, rising steam meant ancestors were watching, bearing witness when justice was delayed. I prayed they were watching now. One of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "That's a harsh thing to say to your own father." My daughter's smile stiffened, but she recovered quickly. "Truth isn't always pretty," she said coldly. The room fell into uneasy silence. Inside me, however, silence turned to fire. Her escalation had crossed a line. She wasn't only mocking me privately anymore. She was stripping away my dignity before the eyes of the community. Silence has its own way of speaking. That night, my silence told me one thing. The moment to use the key was drawing closer. After that disastrous dinner, I walked home alone beneath the dim street lamps. The chill of the night clung to my bones, but what weighed heavier was the sting of humiliation. Yet in the quiet, a memory surfaced, one I had nearly forgotten. Years ago, when my wife was still alive, we met with a lawyer, an old friend of hers from school. His name was Mr. Choi, a man with silver-framed glasses and a calm voice that never rose above a murmur. He had helped us secure the deed to the house, guiding us through every clause, insisting we keep an ironclad copy separate from the official filing. I remembered him warning us, "Families change. Blood is no guarantee of loyalty. Protect your home, even from those you love." At the time, I thought his words too cynical. I believed love would hold us together. Now I understood the wisdom in his caution. I went to the study and rummaged through the old desk again. Beneath the ledgers, wrapped in brittle paper yellowed with age, was a second sealed envelope. My heart raced as I lifted it. The handwriting on the front was Mr. Choi's "Keep sealed until necessary." My wife had tucked it away with care. Somehow in the years of grief and silence I'd forgotten it existed. I didn't open it yet. The weight of the envelope in my hand was enough to remind me that I wasn't powerless. There were still safeguards, hidden allies waiting for their time. I slipped it back into the drawer, locking it tight, the brass key of the safe still hanging against my leg like a faithful guardian. The next morning, I visited the old district courthouse under the pretense of renewing some papers. I asked quietly about Mr. Choi. The clerk told me he had retired to a small village, but his son had taken over his practice. A spark of hope flickered in me. The law was still on my side, though my daughter thought me too frail, too ignorant to wield it. I recalled a folktale about a farmer who buried seeds in the winter snow. Everyone mocked him, certain they would rot. But when spring came, the seeds sprouted stronger than ever. Holding that sealed envelope, I felt like that farmer. I had planted something long ago, something waiting to bloom, when the frost of betrayal finally melted. But I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. I waited until the house was silent before I pulled the envelope from the drawer again. The weight of it seemed to pulse in my hand as though it carried not just paper, but destiny. My wife's careful hiding, Mr. Choi's stern warning, it all led to this sealed bundle of truth. The wax at the flap was brittle, cracked with time, but still unbroken. My fingers hovered, trembling. To open it meant no return. I sat beneath the yellow glow of the desk lamp, the shadows of the room leaning in like silent witnesses. With a deep breath, I slid the letter opener under the flap. The seal gave way with a soft snap, a sound that felt louder than thunder. Inside was a stack of documents neatly tied with a thin cord. On top lay a note in Mr. Choi's firm handwriting. In case of dispute, these confirm rightful ownership. Do not reveal until necessary. My chest tightened as I skimmed the contents. Deeds, notarized copies, and most crucially, a letter of attestation signed by Mr. Choi himself, stating that all property, house, land savings remained in my name exclusively unless I chose otherwise. My daughter's schemes, her whispered calls, her arrogant preparations, all of it would collapse under the weight of these pages. And then, tucked between the documents, a smaller folded sheet in my wife's handwriting. I recognized the gentle curves of her pen immediately. It was not legal language, but a message. If you are reading this, it means our daughter has forgotten what we built. Protect yourself. Protect her, even from herself, and remember later will come. Tears blurred my vision. I pressed the paper to my lips as though kissing her hand again. She had foreseen this moment, or at least feared it might arrive, and she had trusted me to carry the weight alone. I slipped the documents back into their envelope, sealing it as best I could. Then I walked to the safe, the brass key cold and familiar in my palm. The lock clicked open, echoing softly in the quiet room. Inside, I placed the envelope next to the photograph and the ledger, aligning them as though arranging soldiers before battle. I shut the safe firmly, the metal door closing with a sound that felt like a vow. Somewhere deep inside, anger softened into resolve. I would not strike yet, not until the time was right. My silence would be my shield, the envelope my sword. But I thought I was safe, and I was wrong. The next betrayal did not come from my daughter's lips alone. It came from the man she had chosen to stand beside her. One evening, I returned home earlier than expected and heard voices drifting from the kitchen. I paused in the hallway, the brass safe key pressing against my thigh like a warning bell. Her husband's voice was low but firm. "He's lived long enough in that house. We need it now. If he won't leave willingly, there are other ways." My daughter laughed, soft but sharp. "He doesn't even know what he has. He clings to old papers and useless memories. Once it's in our name, he'll have no choice but to go." The words twisted in my chest, each syllable a nail driven deeper. My son-in-law, whom I had once welcomed like a son, was plotting with her to erase me. Betrayal from one's child is unbearable enough. Betrayal doubled by her chosen partner is nearly fatal. I thought back to the day he first came to dinner, bowing politely, praising my cooking. I had offered him the largest piece of fish, believing he would protect my daughter's happiness. Now, years later, he sharpened his tongue against me, whispering strategies as if I were an obstacle rather than family. I stepped quietly into the room, letting the wooden floor creak under my foot. They froze, eyes wide, then quickly rearranged their faces into masks of innocence. "Dad?" My daughter said too sweetly, "We were just discussing future plans." Her husband nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, just thinking ahead. You know it's good to be prepared." Prepared for my disappearance. That was what they meant. On the counter beside them sat an ordinary object, a bowl of dried persimmons. My wife used to love them, drying them carefully in the winter sun. Seeing them here, half-eaten and neglected, felt like another betrayal. An ordinary sweetness turned bitter. I recalled a curious detail I once read. In some traditions, eating persimmons was said to soften the tongue to make words gentle. But tonight their tongues had been sharpened to knives. I said nothing. Instead, I let silence stretch until it pressed against their skin like a second air. Then I walked away, leaving them in their own unease. But silence has its own way of speaking. And that night it told me I was no longer facing my daughter alone. It was just after dusk when I heard the knock. Slow, hesitant, like someone unsure if they should be there at all. I opened the door to find Mr. Hahn, my neighbor of nearly 20 years, standing on the step. His cap was pulled low, his eyes darting up and down the street before he spoke. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked softly. I nodded, stepping aside. He sat at the edge of the chair as if ready to flee, his hands twisting nervously. Finally, he leaned closer. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but I heard something tonight. Something you need to know." My chest tightened. "What is it, Hahn?" He lowered his voice until it was barely above a whisper. "Your daughter and her husband were talking outside by their car. They didn't see me." He told her, "The sooner the old man's gone, the sooner we can move in." She didn't argue. She just nodded. The words struck like a hammer blow. I gripped the arm of the chair until my knuckles ached. Mr. Hahn placed a hand on my shoulder. "I don't know what's happening in your house, but be careful. Don't trust too easily. Sometimes danger comes from the people closest to you." I thanked him, though my voice shook. When he left, the silence in the house seemed louder than before. I wandered into the kitchen where the teapot still sat from earlier. Steam no longer rose from it. It had cooled completely. An ordinary object, but tonight it looked strange, like a symbol of warmth turned cold. A curious folktale surfaced in my memory. Villagers once believed that if a teapot stopped whistling, suddenly it meant betrayal was near. I never believed such stories. Yet tonight the sight of that cold pot sent a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded with the truth. This was no longer only about greed or humiliation. There was danger now. A shadow creeping closer. My wife's words. For later echoed in my ears. Later might arrive sooner than I ever expected. Silence has its own way of speaking, and tonight it told me to prepare. The night after Mr. Hahn's warning, I couldn't rest. I sat in the study, staring at the wall where the old cabinet stood. Behind it, hidden for years, waited the safe, silent patient, heavy with secrets. My fingers brushed the brass key on its chain, the cool metal steadying my trembling hands. My wife's voice seemed to whisper again. For later. But what if later was now? I pulled the cabinet aside, its legs scraping against the wooden floor, with a groan like an old man waking. There it was, the safe, its iron face dull with dust, but its lock glinting faintly in the lamplight. My heart thudded as I slid the key in. The click of the tumblers falling into place echoed louder than it should have. When the door swung open, the smell of old paper and faint cedar filled the air. Inside, everything remained as I had left it, the ledger of quiet savings, the folded deeds, the sealed envelope from Mr. Choi, and tucked to one side the photograph of my wife and daughter beneath the cherry blossoms. Her handwriting on the back, "Promise her a future, for later," stared at me like a command. I pulled out the envelope again, placing it on the desk. My hands hovered, but I didn't open it further. Instead, I carefully organized everything, stacking the documents in neat order as though preparing for battle. This was not just money or property, it was proof of my life's work evidence that I had not failed as a father no matter what she screamed in her anger. In that moment, silence wrapped around me, heavy but protective. I thought of something curious I once read in a history book during the Joseon dynasty. Families often buried important records in clay jars beneath the earth, trusting silence and secrecy more than locks. My safe was my clay jar, my last fortress. I sat for a long time, staring at the photograph, wondering how love had turned into this war. Then I placed everything back inside, turned the key, and locked it tight. The sound of the metal clicking shut was like a vow, but I soon realized that wasn't the worst of it. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. One evening, I returned from a short walk to find my daughter waiting in the living room. Her husband sat beside her, his arms folded, eyes narrowed. The lights were bright too, bright, making the room feel like an interrogation chamber. On the table lay a stack of papers neatly arranged and a pen poised beside them. "Dad," she began, her tone dripping with practiced calm. "We need to talk. It's time to make things official. If you sign these documents, everything will be simpler for everyone." I glanced at the papers. Property transfer forms. They wanted me to hand over the house, the land, everything my wife and I had built. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak evenly. "And what will I have left if I sign?" My son-in-law leaned forward, his voice sharp. "A room here, a bed, food. We'll take care of you, but the property belongs with us now. It's practical." Practical. The word burned like acid. My daughter avoided my eyes, fiddling with her pen. Finally, she looked up, her mask slipping. "Don't be stubborn, Dad. Everyone knows you have nothing. Just sign." I sat back, the brass safe key pressing against my thigh, grounding me. Their arrogance emboldened me. I let the silence stretch, then said softly, "You think I have nothing. You're wrong." Her husband scoffed. "What could you possibly have? Look at you. You're a poor old man clinging to scraps." Slowly, I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the key and set it on the table. The faint metallic clink cut through the silence like thunder. Their eyes followed it, confusion flickering across their faces. My daughter's voice trembled for the first time in months. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I simply let my hand rest on the key the way a soldier rests his hand on the hilt of a sword. "There are things you don't know," I said quietly. "Things your mother and I prepared long before you decided I was worthless." The room froze. For the first time, it was not I who was silent, it was them. Silence has its own way of speaking, and in that moment it spoke louder than any insult they had ever thrown. The confrontation at home was only the beginning. Days later, I received a notice from the district office, a summons. My daughter and her husband had taken the matter to court, filing a petition to transfer ownership, claiming I was unfit to manage my own affairs. My hands trembled as I read the stamped letter, but deep inside a strange calm steadied me. They thought they were tightening the noose. In truth, they were pulling me onto the very stage where truth could no longer be hidden. The courtroom was stark, its walls painted in dull cream, the air carrying the faint scent of paper and dust. I walked in slowly, the brass safe key in my pocket pressing like a heartbeat. My daughter sat at the petitioner's table, her hair perfectly styled, her face composed in an expression of false concern. Beside her, her husband whispered instructions like a puppeteer tugging strings. The judge, an older man with sharp glasses, cleared his throat. "We are here to hear the case regarding Mr. Park's estate. Petitioners allege that the respondent is unable to manage property and request transfer of ownership." My daughter rose, her voice smooth as silk. "Your Honor, my father has nothing left. He clings to scraps and old memories. We simply wish to protect what little remains before it slips away. We have taken care of him, but it's time for practicality." Her words echoed the ones she had thrown at me in the living room. Practicality. To her, it was a weapon. To me, it was betrayal dressed as reason. I remained silent as she spoke, the room filled with her carefully woven lies. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. My knees ached, but my voice when it came was steady. Your Honor, I said I may be old, but I am not powerless. And I am not penniless. From my bag I pulled the sealed envelope, its wax cracked from age, and placed it on the desk. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My daughter's face blanched, her composure slipping for the first time. The judge gestured for the bailiff to bring the envelope forward. As the documents were unfolded, the truth lay bare: deeds, notarized copies, and the letter of attestation from Mr. Choi affirming my exclusive ownership. I watched the judge's eyes scan the pages, his brows lifting slightly before he nodded. The silence that followed was deafening. My daughter's lips trembled, her husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time in years, the power no longer sat with them. I thought I was safe, but I was wrong. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as a crack of thunder. These documents are valid, he declared, his voice firm. Ownership of the house, land, and accounts remains solely with Mr. Park. His words echoed through the courtroom, each syllable like a hammer breaking the chains my daughter had tried to fasten around me. I watched her face drain of color. Just days ago she laughed at my patched jacket, my empty wallet. Now her eyes darted wildly as if searching for a crack in the floor to swallow her whole. Her husband leaned forward, whispering furiously, but she didn't answer. For once, her tongue so sharp, so cruel, was silent. The judge continued. Attempting to transfer property under false pretenses is not only unethical, but unlawful. This court will not entertain petitions built on greed and deception. He looked directly at my daughter, and she lowered her gaze. The sound of pens scratching from clerks filled the silence, the final punctuation to her schemes. I remained still, but inside a storm of emotions surged. Relief, sorrow, vindication, all tangled together. I thought of the folk tale my wife used to tell our daughter: lies are like shadows, they vanish when light shines. The light had finally arrived, harsh and blinding, exposing everything. The judge handed the documents back to me. My fingers brushed over the faded ink of my wife's note for later. This was later. Her foresight had saved me, had preserved the truth when even I doubted myself. Around us, relatives who had come to support sat frozen. They had heard my daughter's cruel words at dinners, had smirked when she mocked me. Now, none of them met my eyes. Silence filled the benches, heavy with shame. I glanced at my daughter one last time. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her face, pale and stiff, told the story she could not. Silence has its own way of speaking, and in that silence, the truth had been laid bare for all to see. The walk out of the courtroom felt longer than the hearing itself. My cane tapped softly against the marble floor, each strike steady, deliberate. Behind me, I could hear the faint shuffle of my daughter's heels, hesitant, now stripped of the confidence that once carried her. She did not call my name, did not try to explain. Silence was her only companion, and in that silence I felt the weight of all the years between us. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. I squinted against its glare, and for a moment I thought of my wife. She would have stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm, her voice reminding me that patience always bears fruit. The brass safe key pressed against my thigh, a reminder of her foresight, of promises that had endured betrayal. Relatives who had attended lingered at the steps, their faces flushed with unease. One uncle, who had laughed too loudly at my daughter's cruel jokes in the past, cleared his throat and muttered, "You were right to stand firm, brother," but his eyes never met mine. Their shame was not for what they had done, but for being caught on the wrong side of truth. I said nothing. Words would have been wasted. Instead, I adjusted the envelope in my bag, its weight both burden and shield. Inside were the deeds, the ledger, the letter of attestation, all proof that silence, patience, and preparation had outlasted greed. My daughter and her husband hurried past me, their steps quick, eyes averted. She brushed against me, but did not pause, her perfume lingering faintly in the air. Once that scent had reminded me of laughter and youth. Today it smelled of ashes. I paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps, leaning on my cane, letting the sun warm my face. A curious thought came to me. In some traditions, justice is represented not by a sword, but by a scale balanced in silence. Today, the scales had tipped not through shouting or vengeance, but through quiet truth. Still, the victory felt hollow. I had protected my home, my name, my dignity. Yet the cost was visible in the pale, trembling face of the girl who once held my hand on the walk to school. I'd saved myself, but I had lost her. But I soon realized that wasn't the end of it. I returned home with the safe key still heavy in my pocket. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that once comforted me but now pressed against my chest like a weight. I set my cane by the door, hung my old jacket, and walked slowly into the study. The safe waited behind the cabinet, patient as ever. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its secret had already done its work. I sank into the chair, staring at the faint light filtering through the curtains. My wife's handwriting still lingered in my memory for later. She had been right. Later came, later saved me, later proved the truth. But it also revealed something harder to bear, that the daughter we raised with love had turned her back on me. I pulled the photograph from the drawer, the one of her as a child holding her mother's hand beneath the cherry blossoms. The edges were curled, the ink faded, but the smile was still there, wide and pure. I pressed it to my chest, wondering where that little girl had gone and whether she might ever return. Justice had been served, the deeds were safe, the house still mine, the dignity restored. But victory without reconciliation tastes bitter. I thought of a line I once read in a book of old proverbs: winning against your child is losing twice. I understood it now. The law had sided with me, but the bond between us had shattered. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of spring. I imagined my wife's voice riding the breeze, gentle but firm. Forgive even when it hurts. Perhaps forgiveness was the final key, one that no safe could hold. I don't know what the future holds. Perhaps she will come back one day, not for property, not for wealth, but for family. Perhaps she won't. All I know is that I will keep the safe key close, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder that silence, patience, and truth outlast even betrayal. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, please subscribe and continue with the next story in the playlist.